Right, I can see people are still floating in, but we might get a start because we've ticked over to about one and a half past the hour. Welcome everybody. My name is Eamon Waterford. I'm the Deputy CEO and the Director of Policy for the Committee for Sydney. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to this event on property tax reform. To start the event, I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on. This is a conversation that the committee is really excited to be having. We have had a long-standing passion for tax reform, and specifically for tax reform when it comes to possibly Australia's worst tax, stamp duty. The idea of transition from stamp duty to land tax has been something that's been on the agenda for many years, but has seen by numerous governments of both sides and many states as being too politically difficult to implement. And that's why we're so excited to see the New South Wales Government, and particularly the New South Wales Treasurer and his team in the New South Wales Treasury, undertake what is a seriously bold reform in this space. And so as part of that process, which is currently underway for community consultation, we're delighted to be joined by some speakers who are involved in organising and pushing forward this reform. We've got two speakers, as you can see on the screen. Joann Wilkie is the Deputy Secretary for New South Wales Treasury's Economic Strategy and Productivity Group. And James Hunter is a Senior Partner at KPMG, and he's also the co-lead of the Tax Reform Taskforce for the government. The two of these two speakers are going to take us through a bit of an overview of what the reform looks like and the process thus far. And then there's going to be an opportunity for questions from the audience. So for those of you in the audience, you'll see at the bottom of your screen a questions button. You can type in your questions, and following the presentations from Joann and James, we'll have an opportunity for me to ask some of those questions and get into a bit of a discussion. And I've already got a couple of my own, so it's sure to be a good discussion. But without further ado, I'm going to throw over to the two of you. Joann, I believe you're going to be up first. Welcome. Hello, how are you going?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you, Eamon. Yes, and it is very exciting. I agree to be involved in tax reform. I started my career as a public servant in 1999 in the Commonwealth Treasury, and one of the early things I started working on was the GST. So it is definitely a long time between drinks when it comes to major tax reform in terms of my working career as well. I too, before I get started fully into the presentation, would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm coming from you today, the mighty Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait people who are participating in the event today, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So I think that's a really lovely way to start most presentations. It has a lot of meaning for me in the sense that the caring for country that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do resonates really deeply for me, because I'm a very long-term public servant, and that idea of stewarding the public value on behalf of citizens is something that I feel quite deeply. And that's why working on something like tax reform for me has a lot of energy that comes with that, because it is about, at the end, in the end, getting, in this sort of case, looking at it from purely the economist point of view, about getting a more productive economy and a more efficient economy. But this is also these sorts of reforms where you really get to help individual people as well. One of the things that we know in terms of our analysis around this reform is that undertaking this property tax reform is how we get to help the people of New South Wales achieve that dream of home ownership, which is so important in the Australian culture, as well as growing the economy. So it's something that really resonates. So in terms of what we're here to do and to talk to you about in terms of its property tax reform, and you can switch through to the slide, the introduction slide. Thank you. So as I've already said, the vision in this space in terms of property tax reform is about helping people get to own their own home, get greater freedom to choose the right home for themselves for their stage of life. It's also about, so how are we planning to do that? It's about giving people the choice to avoid a large upfront cost of stamp duty and land tax where that's applicable, and instead to pay a smaller annual property tax. So the proposed tax that we're talking about here and that we're consulting on will ultimately replace stamp duty and land tax using this transition approach that relies on individual choices of people when they are purchasing a property. So it won't impact at the current juncture if you're not in the property market. So in terms of sort of, there's been a lot of discussion about this reform going back, 20, 30 years in terms of getting rid of stamp duties, be it on property or other things. Economists has long talked about that as sort of being the next holy grail once we got the GST in place for Australian tax agencies. So it's been talked about for a long time coming. It's really great to be having a conversation about this now, and it's really heartening to see the engagement we're getting with the consultation process, and James will talk to that in a little bit. It was actually also really fortuitous, I think, that the New South Wales budget day ended up being on the 17th of November, which, as you may recall, was a day or so after the Governor of the Reserve Bank had given a major speech about the economy, in which he said one of the things we needed to do was economic reform, like taxation reform. Tuesday, the New South Wales budget comes down, the Treasurer makes the announcement around this proposal and the fact that we're going to consult on it. And then a couple of days later, Phil was back out in the public domain and was specifically asked what he thought about this tax reform proposal, and he gave it a tick of approval. So that was very, very well timed in some respects for our part, but really great to see the way it was received in those early sort of couple of days of the consultation, and how much energy it engendered. And since then, we've had a ongoing conversation with various stakeholders about what the reform means and what the proposal is, and what people's views on that is. So in terms of the case for change, as an economist, to some extent for me, it looks like a no-brainer, but always good to reiterate exactly why we're here to do something. So the first thing, like I said, is around boosting home ownership. We see this reform as one that will help people get into the housing market, or help them change to get a house that's better, more appropriate for them, by removing or giving them the choice to remove one of the biggest upfront barriers to buying a home, which is stamp duty. It takes on average about 2.5 years to save for stamp duty for a property. And I know from personal experience, having moved from Canberra to Sydney recently, just that added extra amount of stamp duty that I knew I was going to need to pay, moving from one property market to the other, where there's quite a difference in property values. It took longer than I expected, even just, so that's one of the other things that we want to be able to address here, is that the mobility issue, where people don't, there are surveys that have shown that, like the Productivity Commission's work, that 25% of households say that they're not going to move and stamp duty is one of the key drivers of that. So it does affect mobility in terms of people who might be thinking about moving for work or education, and it does impact on people purchasing a property at a particular point in time that's not actually fit for current purpose. So whether you're just married and you're purchasing a property together and you're thinking, well, we're figuring we're going to have a family and we're planning to have 2 or 3 kids, and so they're buying a 4 or 5 bedroom home when possibly all they really need is a 2-bedroom apartment. So those are the sorts of barriers that stamp duty puts up because it discourages property transactions, and those are the sorts of reasons, apart from it will grow the economy and it will improve efficiency and productivity. It's looking at what it means for individuals, and how that impacts then sort of in terms of the government's broader vision around making New South Wales a great place to live, work, play, raise your family. It's about looking at how you enhance the well-being of individuals and their families as well. So in terms of then the timing of putting out this reform, we had a lot of people sort of saying, well, you know, the transition potentially takes, you know, there's a debt issue associated with the transition, but there's also a stimulating impact that it has on the economy, which at the moment, with the COVID recession, is actually a benefit for us. So these reforms on our analysis indicate that we could inject $11 billion into the economy over the first 4 years if this reform is to go ahead, which is sort of a good timing in terms of the COVID-19 economic recession. Annie, you can go to the next, actually flick through to the next one for me. So what is this reform that we're talking about? Now, some of you may have read the consultation paper line by line, but for those of you that may have only just done a scan read or just checked through the the executive summary, maybe even a couple of months ago, just a quick refresher. The proposal is, and the consultation process that we have at the moment is we've put forward some proposals around some reform principles, and we're seeking feedback on those. So the property tax would be an annual tax on land value. It would consist of a fixed amount plus a rate applied to the unimproved land value of an individual property, not to aggregated land holdings. This sort of is using a similar approach mechanism to the approach used for council rates. The idea that we've put forward is that we would use balanced rates. So residential owner occupiers and primary production properties would pay lower rates than investment properties, which in turn would pay lower rates than commercial properties. That we know the ACT approach to undertaking this sort of reform is the concern people have around, will this affect my property now? I've already paid stamp duty. I don't want to be paying double taxation. So one of the key principles underlying this our proposed approach to this reform is, if you are not buying a property, your tax does not change. So if you've already paid stamp duty on your property, you don't have to pay the property tax. And that then rolls into one of the other very key principles of this transition approach is that buyers are going to be given the choice of which tax to pay. So you can choose, if you are going into the property market to purchase a property, you can choose to pay a stamp duty if this proposed reform goes through, and land tax if applicable, or you can choose to pay an annual property tax that replaces both the stamp duty and the land tax. So that factor of choice is really important, and the fact that it is only going to affect you if you are actively going into the market to purchase a property. It doesn't affect you if you're not active in the market. So the final 4 principles that sort of underpin this reform, price thresholds are going to help us maintain fiscal responsibility should the reform go ahead. So we'll use price thresholds to limit the number of properties that are going to be eligible to start with for the transition. That will help us keep control of the revenue and the debt impacts, but will also ensure that we've got 80% of the residential properties are eligible to opt in from the first day. The reform is also proposed to be revenue neutral. So in the short term, the model will reduce the New South Wales Government's revenue as we've got people choosing to opt into the property tax and therefore not paying stamp duty, and rather that they're then opting for that smaller annual charge. Over the longer term, the proposal is that the property tax would be revenue neutral, and over the longer term collect the same amount of revenue as stamp duty and land tax would have if we hadn't had the reform. There will be protections applied so that the property tax doesn't result in rent increases without a tenant's agreement. Protections including things like hardship schemes, so that would recognise taxpayers' financial situations can change over time, and ensuring that no one facing hardship would end up having to sell their property to meet property tax liabilities. And finally, should the reform go ahead, the existing stamp duty concessions for first home buyers will be replaced with an upfront grant of $25,000 for first home buyers. So that's the possible reform framework that we're talking about, the principles, the case for change. I will now hand over to James so he can talk to you about what does this actually mean for people who are going into the property market. James, over to you.
Thanks, Joanne, and thanks, Simon, for the presentation opportunity with Committee for Sydney. I think to bring this into some examples, we've got a couple of case studies. Joanne's already referred to the website under New South Wales Treasury. And if you just Google New South Wales Treasury property tax, you'll find it'll take you straight to a link. And there'll be a whole lot of examples. We've just taken 2 out. There's a lot on there. And if you're thinking the 2 we've picked aren't necessarily representative of what you're interested in, there's a lot more there. And we'll keep adding examples and case studies through the next 3-4 months. The first one, though, I put here as a residential example of a regional family. And we've had a lot of feedback in the last 12 months. During the last 12 months of COVID, that a lot of people moved, whether it be healthcare workers, whether it be teachers, a whole range of occupations, and they move more frequently than they otherwise may have moved in the past. And so we put an example up straight away of Jake and Natalie, a young family, 2 young kids, and they're both teachers. And an example here where they move into, let's call it Bathurst in 2021, they buy a $600,000 home, and they have a choice as they're about to buy a house of paying $22,000 stamp duty or paying just over $1,500 a year in property tax. That property tax can be paid annually, quarterly, monthly, fortnightly, and that's an option that they have in terms of the frequency of how they pay it. 3 years later, Natalie gets a promotion, gets to go to Coffs Harbour, so they all move, and they sell their house and buy house 2. They buy a $700,000 house, the stamp duty is higher, or they pay $1,675 per annum, which is about $5,000 over 3 years. And then 3 years later, they purchase a house again, they're given another promotion, they move up to maybe Porry, and they have an $800,000 house. So you can see over 3 different transactions here, the stamp duty is over $80,000 if they were actually buying those homes. Or if they're looking just at the property tax, it's about $11,000. So clearly you would take that example and say, well, in that case, what they would otherwise have done is probably rent, because that's $80,000, which is pretty much tax they've just paid, which is money forgone. With property tax, they have the ability, rather than renting, to actually buy. And in the market, they can actually then take some of the capital gains. They have to pay CGT on that because it's primary residence. And they have the ability to each time they move to actually buy something. Now, you may think, well, 3 years is quite a short period of time. If that was 5 years or even 10 years, you'll find property tax is going to be a better option. But the reason we put out the example with some summaries there for you is people need to look at their own circumstances to work out which is going to be the best for them. And one of the key determinants is obviously going to be the actual period of time that they're going to be in the home. So that's a fairly standard residential example. And there are a lot of people, while I'm just staying on that slide, that are looking to potentially move into the property market earlier. And to Joanne's comment about housing affordability, rather than knowing that you have to pay a 20 or 30,000 stamp duty, we got a lot of feedback from user group testing that younger people in their 20s, early 30s are going to buy an apartment, maybe even a 1-bedroom, a studio, small 2-bedroom, and buy it for the next 5 years because that's what they want right now, knowing that they can sell it, having not had to pay a big stamp duty, and buy something else for another 3 to 5 years, and then buy their home and they have a family, etc., as the second or third property. And it's people buying earlier, people buying more what they need for that period of time, what they need for their life stage, which is one of the really attractive parts of this reform, because the feedback we had, exactly as Joanne said, it's a huge impediment, having stamp duty and a huge impost that's restricting people buying earlier, 2.5 years extra to be saving just for that stamp duty for that home, and then often have really been overburdened with a really significant debt bill for the next 25, 30 years. If we go to the next slide, Anna, one of the examples we also want to put up was commercial. And we've been working really closely with the Property Council of Australia, with UDIA, the Urban Development Institute of Australia. Steve, Jane have been fantastic with a number of the senior members of those respective organisations in thinking through all the commercial side, because this will be for all properties in New South Wales. And so we picked actually an example. We've masked it rather than putting the name of the actual centre, but we put some real numbers in here. to try and bring it to life of what this might mean on a commercial site. On a commercial shopping centre, this would be on maybe a mid-sized sort of regional shopping centre. The land value is around 25 mil. And if you look at that on the 25 mil, that's sort of a ratio of 14% of land value over total capital value or purchase price. And that's not untypical or atypical of the sort of shopping value ratio. They would pay, or they did pay, 9.6 million in stamp duty and an annual land tax of $500,000 a year. They now have a choice of paying the stamp duty and land tax or an annual property tax. And the property tax, based on the calculations and the formula we've got, would be $650,000 a year. There's no upfront stamp duty, so it's stamp duty and land tax or property tax. So you can see pretty quickly, looking down the sums there, that the break even on that is almost 6 decades. You can start to look at a whole range of other numbers on commercial, and you can start to work out, even people that are holding property for a reasonably long period of time, the break even is actually going to depend on the ratio of land value to the whole capital value purchase price. But from someone who's looking at yield, someone who's looking at the rates of return from a REIT or from an institutional investor perspective, you'll need to do your own sums. But you can see that property tax isn't just aimed at mums and dads. Commercial is actually going to be able to have quite a favourable outcome here as well. And Joann already alluded to 80% of residential will be able to opt in with those thresholds. We're helping well north of 90% of commercial will opt in as well. And that's a lot of smaller commercial properties across the state, both in metro and in regional New South Wales, that'll be able to opt in and take advantage of property tax from day one. So as I said, just 2 quick case studies. We could probably do a lot more, but I thought that brings it to life a little bit and allows you to see the decision point and working out your own calculations. If we go to the next slide, Anna, and we go to 2 slides forward, we start to look at the consultation feedback. And that hasn't moved on my slide deck yet, but it's probably about to change. I'm not sure if that's moved on yours. Oh, there we go. Summary of the public consultation feedback. If we go to the next one, that'd be great, Anna. Thank you. We planned this consultation period of 4 months. And I've got to say, having looked at a lot of reforms, and I've personally been involved in a lot of reforms over the last 2 decades, it's one of the longest and most extensive consultation periods I've ever been involved in or aware of. So 4 months, we've had almost 20,000 people from a whole range of different sectors, and over 80 organisations have reached out and said, we'd really be interested in finding out more about what this means for us, for our sector, for our organisation. We've set up user group testing both before the launch of the proposed property tax on the 17th of November, as Joann mentioned, as well as one-on-one meetings. We have a Have Your Say website, and online surveys continue to give us a really good view of people's concerns, what people feel with their personal circumstances, what this will mean for them, and what are any of the concerns and issues that they have that they'd like clarified. And that's really been useful because we've got frequently asked questions up on the site, and we're going to keep refreshing those all the way through. But I put the middle column there because it gives you a breadth of thinking about the number of industries that are going to be impacted, from farmers and mining, the real estate. We've been working closely with the Real Estate Institute of New South Wales all the way through, and we'll continue to do that. But you can imagine for a real estate agent, this is going to have quite a significant impact. Our modelling shows that this is going to increase the number of transactions between 30 and 60% over the medium longer term. So the number of properties buying and selling, giving that example before of people buying a little bit earlier and transacting more frequently, which is going to mean more transaction volume. And for anyone involved in real estate market and markets, you can see there are going to be some beneficiaries of the increased supply demand and the increased fluidity and liquidity in this whole market. Financial services, we've been working closely with ABA, Australian Banking Association, and individual banks as they think about the implications for them and their mortgage processes, their borrowing, how they actually going to determine if someone's going to be taking a property tax and the serviceability of that liability ongoing and that repayment, or having the stamp duty. And some people will go into auctions or go into different purchases unsure. And so financial services will have to look at both in parallel. Commercial property developers, and we've also spent a lot of time looking at post-65, looking at retirement, looking at aged care. We had a great session 2 days ago on retirement villages. What's the implication? And for community services. And all the way through, we've had a number of economists actually providing us feedback of their view, and they've been almost unanimously really positive of this reform. I think, if anything, they want it to happen faster. The areas of impact and areas of feedback, I'm actually going to go through those 8 in a minute, but I thought I'd just list them because they've come directly from all that consultation. So, Anna, if we move to the next slide, a couple of quotes. You may have seen some of these in the media. The first one I would say is the Commonwealth is closely aligned. We've been working with them closely. Joann, the Secretary, Mike Pratt, the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, are very aware of what we're doing with this, as are the other states who are looking at the response, looking at the positive response that's coming through on this reform. And we're working with them very closely on the potential of the productivity reforms and benefits. And there's been a lot of discussion recently around Commonwealth saying the states really need to have a material impact into the productivity reforms that they're going to be taking as we recover, both by state and nationally, from this pandemic recession. We've had, as we said, great feedback and great interaction with the Property Council of Australia. And on the right-hand side, I give an example of the type of quote that you may have seen from Mark from Stockland. And we have a lot of this feedback, which is increasingly being collected from people that are putting quotes in and putting information in to have your say. The customer journey on the next slide is really quite complex, because while you might think, well, it's just a decision I have to make at the time of wanting to buy a property, what it is attracting a lot more people to be thinking about buying now that they may not have been buying in the past. And already, I think you will have read the media that there's quite a strong market at the moment, driven by historically low interest rates, obviously, a bit of pent-up demand from the last 6-9 months of uncertainty. And also some of the challenges at the moment. The apartment approvals and completions are down significantly from 2016. And the demand, I think, of people wanting to get into the market or change with their circumstances that are changing mean those transaction volumes and the clearance rates are very high. Some stats there on the left, which are worth understanding: 2.8 million properties in New South Wales, just under 200,000 roughly transactions in a year. And that 6% is important, because that means about 6% of people or properties in New South Wales transact each year. And so for 94% of properties that don't transact, there's no difference. If this is implemented towards the end of the year, for 94% of people and properties that aren't actually buying, there'll be no change. There's no new taxation, there's no change. But up to 1 in 5 people, and maybe even less now, maybe up to 1 in 4 from a ratio, are considering moving over the next 3 years. So these reforms are getting a huge amount of interest from our user group testing. What is my situation in the journey map is often what people go into next. And we've had a number of really detailed discussion in these steps with banks, with conveyancing, with the ELNOs, the electronic lodgement network operators, the CSPs, etc., to try and think, how do people actually go through this process of understanding their situation? How do they actually find out information about the property tax? How do they do their own calculations? Where do they find out information about unimproved land value when they're investigating properties? And if you put your address in, you'll find you'll actually get a property number, and then you put that in and find your actual value. It's actually also on your council rates, your unimproved land value, but that is going to be the basis, obviously, of the calculation. So it's going to become increasingly important. Pursuing a property, calculators to help you make up your own decision about which is going to be the best option, and advisors who will help you with that sort of calculation. Settling finances and purchasing a property, and then what happens post the actual settlement process right through is something we're also looking at. But you can see there's a number of steps there, and there's quite a lot of change management that's going to have to be affected if the proposed property tax gets implemented through the back half of this year. I thought I'd finish by just going into the areas of feedback in a little bit more time, and I'm conscious we want to allow enough time for questions. And these are the 8 questions, and there's probably, I don't know, somewhere north of 300 sort of question groups that are now coming through, and we're getting very used to the groupings. But these would be the 8 main ones that we're getting, so it's worth just touching on these. The first one is there is misinformation still out there, regardless of how many times people like Joann and I talk to people. that there's no double taxation. If you're not actually buying a property, there's no change. And if you are buying a property, there's a choice. And you have to make the choice between either stamp duty and the new property tax, or if you're an investor or in commercial, then there's land tax and a stamp duty, or just the property tax, and hence there's different rates. So no double tax, there's no impact, as I said, for the vast majority of people from the launch date. The second one is pensioners, retirees, a number of groups, including farmers, we look at here. We try and look at how some might be impacted by the hardship of an ongoing payment. You know, we gave the example before. I think one example was about $1,600, one was almost $2,000 a year. And we're going to put in place a hardship scheme, and we're looking closely at the financial situation of that. Three categories. We have people who are short-term impacted, people who have a long-term track record and are well known to government of facing hardship and facing hardship across a whole range of their bills that they pay. And then there's bound to be a small element that actually think here's a chance to try and get something into a hardship scheme when really they're not going to satisfy the criteria. And so we're going to be looking at those closely and making sure that no one loses their property because they're unable to pay the actual property tax. And a number of mechanisms we're going to put in place there through the criteria, and then the way we can support people in those scenarios. The cost to the government. The cost of the government has been alluded to by the Treasurer, and Joann just mentioned $11 billion over the next 4 years. If you think of where does that number come from, if you think of earning $30,000 stamp duty or only in year one getting $2,000 from a property tax, you can see that straight away the government's going to have to fund the $28,000 difference there. But that's putting money into the hands of people at the time when we need it most. And $11 billion into the economy at the moment is going to add a very significant stimulus to the economy. The debt, that's going to be debt funded, so there's not going to be any impact on services across other government services. But make sure that debt remains within the reasonable limits is why we alluded to the thresholds that we're going to be putting in place. And we're constantly modelling that as we get more and more feedback around opt-in rates and the feedback from the different segments. The timeframes and the need for retrospectivity. Retrospectivity, it sounds like a complex term. Just explain it very simply. If there's an announcement, and one of the dates that could be announced, the Treasurer announcing the update on the proposed property tax mid-year, there'll be a number of people who might go, right, well, this is sounding like it's definitely going to happen. It might not happen for another 3-6 months. And they may try and hold back and not purchase. And we don't want that. We don't want to create a sort of dysfunction in the property market. And so we might apply a retrospectivity that could be introduced almost straight away to make sure that people just buy as they were otherwise going to buy in the time frame they were going to buy, and then have a choice of either paying the stamp duty up front and then getting a rebate, and if they opt into the property tax in a period of time. So we don't want to have any delays. If anyone is thinking about delays in the back half of this year, I would certainly say this sort of mechanism will make sure that that can be overridden and not a problem. Number 5, choice. So this is probably one of the cornerstones of the whole reform, but it's one of the things which has been extremely well received. And we mentioned user group testing before. There's very strong positive feedback on this of actually, you don't know my circumstance, government, but giving me a choice, giving me the chance to think about this, work out how long I'm going to be in this new property, allowing all my personal situation to be thought through, and the best one for me to minimize my tax. I like that. And no doubt that will be something that will actually encourage a number of people into the property tax mechanism. It suits their situation. Some pundits have said that, well, choice isn't real. It diminishes rapidly over time. It actually doesn't. If you think of only 6% of properties are actually going to be transacting that first year, maybe roughly half of them might still stay as stamp duty and half of them move to property tax. That might be 40, 50, 60%. We doubt it will be outside that sort of range because a lot of people's circumstances will allow them to make their own call. But even after 20 years, more than 50% of properties are still going to be stamp duty properties and allowing people choice. And if that rate's increasing to 60 or 70%, and people are increasingly opting in to a property tax because they build their trust, they can understand that this is going to be better for their circumstances, I suspect that this will be an issue which will just diminish, and people will, all the way through, have a choice on which one they pick for their particular circumstance. The rates, Joanne already mentioned the rates here, but the very strong feedback that we're going to pick unimproved land value. The other option was picking the actual capital value, so that, if you like, the purchase price. And that actually acts as a disincentive to renovate, improve your home, improve your property. And we didn't want to have that. And unimproved land value is something that actually is on a register and easy to calculate. The thing that we need to then make sure is that there's legislation and there's a periodic independent review to make sure that the pricing and the increases through an indexation process don't increase substantially, and people can actually have some predictability or understanding of how that mechanism will work on an annual basis. What will happen on number 7 to property prices? Well, I'm sure just about everyone on this call will understand that historically low interest rates, whole range of the dynamic of people having pent up demand of wanting to buy and move and change last year, but held off. You can see the sort of clearance rates that we're seeing, not just in New South Wales, but every state at the moment. And so in amongst all that, thinking of the impact of property tax, there is a small impact in amongst all those dimensions of where property tax might impact the property prices. But we've done some extensive modelling, and it is ongoing, the modelling that we're having, to show that over the medium longer term, this will put a downward pressure on prices. As there's a more liquid market, more efficient use of the actual space in the available. If you can imagine the 2.8 million properties, about 27% of that is just underutilized at the moment because people have bought for the future, not what they need right now. And then people have stayed in a property at the end of their kids moving out, and they don't downsize because they have to pay another stamp duty. So it allows a greater efficiency through the whole end-to-end cycle for people. The last thing, improve flexibility and mobility. So much of the feedback that's come back to us is people telling us their stories, telling us their examples, whether it be commercial or whether it actually be on the residential side, of actually trying to make sure that their example's right, and telling us about how actually this would have been so good 5 years ago or 3 years ago, but if it's going to be introduced in the future, does it allow them to do X, Y, and Z? And so that mobility, that flexibility is coming through as a really strong theme. And as I said, it creates a more efficient use of houses. So on the final slide, I just wanted to point then to next steps. Public consultation continues for another month. We were keen to do this Committee for Sydney webinar at this point and encourage you to actually think about the things Joanne and I have gone through and have your say. There's the website there, the views and submissions, there's the email. And we really encourage you to provide us feedback, even feedback on this, maybe asking for some other case studies if we haven't got them on our website. What does this mean in this particular circumstance? Or just give us feedback. It's a very genuine consultation phase. We have a lot of people collecting it all. Daily, we go through all the consultation feedback and we work out how we're responding to it and how it's feeding into both policy and design and how we're actually creating this reform. So the more information around the reform is also shown at that website URL down the bottom. And Eamon, with that, I will open to question and hand back to you.
Thank you, James. Yeah, wow. That I was furiously scribbling down questions, and then you just went along and you answered almost every single one of them as you comprehensively went through, you know, a fascinatingly complex reform. But you know, it's wonderful to see that consideration of all the different nuances around that customer journey questions. You know, where in the process, you know, impacts will have to flow through around understanding unimproved land value and the like. So, you know, that was a really wonderful presentation from both of you. Thank you. It is genuinely appreciated. Look, there's a couple of questions coming through. I'm going to start with, so please add yours to the Q&A if you've got them. One question, one topic that wasn't really touched on is around, you know, there's obviously at large across the market, there will be a slow transition of housing to being part of the land tax regime. Has there been any thinking around particular housing typologies or locations, as in say apartments or, you know, family homes, that will transition quicker or slower?
Yeah, so I'm happy to have a first go and then can hand to Joanne. I could see you on mute at the start, so let me have a go at that. So firstly, so our user group testing, we actually break up, Eamon, into those segments.
Right.
So we're looking at apartments, we're looking at inner city apartments, we look at outer west suburbs, we look at regional, we look at townhouses, we look at homes, we look at wider properties, etc. And one of the things I think that's going to happen is the people buying earlier, people buying things that are more fit for purpose, means that apartments obviously is something that we feel are going to get quite a lot of interest early in this stage. Investors, if you can imagine investors, particularly in what you call flip investors that might not want to hold stock for 10, 15, 20 years and hold it for 3 to 5, may well be transacting more frequently. And what that does in the short term, the pricing, but over the medium, longer term, it actually then smooths out. On homes, it's actually interesting. We're getting a lot of feedback of people will now go in and buy their first home. The first home buyer grant is something that we just touched on one of Joann's slides with the $25,000. A lot of people are attracted by that and thinking this is the moment, this year, next year, to buy that first home and to actually move into it. So in summary, the feedback is pretty strong across all segments, but in particular, I think the apartment side is going to be pretty strong.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it'll be also fascinating to see whether this changes the demand for different typologies, where people are in that middle stage of life where they're ready for the step away from, say, a 2-bedroom apartment to something a little bit larger. They're just starting a family, but there might be greater demand for that sort of medium density interim stage housing that we're not traditionally very good at delivering, because often it's a leap straight from an apartment to a 4-bedroom, house in the burbs. But actually, you can really see how this would change people's meanwhile sort of short-term changes.
I mean, if that's the sort of things we start to see if this reform goes ahead, that we will count that as a success, because that's actually one of the things that the aim is to do, to help it make people be more mobile, to have a property that's more suited to their stage in life. I mean, some of the data that we've looked at shows that up to a quarter to even a third of first home buyers within a couple of years are renting that property out that they've purchased, because the reason is likely to be it wasn't fit for purpose. Maybe they thought buying on a main road was okay, I'll be able to cope with the noise, and they can't, or they've moved jobs, or for whatever reason, or they bought a big house and then it's now too far out for them to commute, so they're now renting an apartment back in the inner city. So seeing those sorts of changes is exactly what we will count as success.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm going to use extremely anecdotal evidence of my own experience, but, buying your first home comes, it sort of, in many people's mind, there's a sort of a process around you buy your first home and not long after you have your first child. So that was the experience for me and my wife. And so you can absolutely see, you buy that first home, you think it's an apartment, a small apartment, maybe 1 to 2 bedrooms, and then you realize, a couple of years later, it's not fit for purpose for what you want. And this provides that greater flexibility rather than staying put, because you're saying, well, look, we already dropped $40,000 in stamp duty on this. It would be wild to go and spend that again. James, you mentioned a couple of times around the sort of the housing affordability question. There's a couple of questions coming around this, around, that there will likely be some limited impacts on house price increases in the short term, but medium, long term, we're likely looking at house price decreases and greater affordability. Perhaps not house price decreases, but certainly greater affordability. My sense is that short-term time frame is sort of that period of time where you've got a cohort of people who've already saved that stamp duty deposit up, and then are able to utilize that in the purchase of the house if they're able to transition to land tax, so that you're looking at that kind of 2.5 year period. Is that your sort of modeling around that period of time we would expect to see a little bump, or is short term longer than that or shorter than that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions in that. So again, I'll have a go, and I'm sure Joann will add some comments. Trying to do the modelling of household affordability is a really complex model, because there are a number of dynamics that are at play, particularly at the moment with COVID and the different dynamics that are playing out at the top. And as I said, the dominant one at the moment is driving interest rates, historical interest rate reductions, and people being able to get loans for sub 2% at the moment, 3 or 4 years, is almost unprecedented. You only have to think back 30 years where they were 16 to 18% to realize it isn't always that way, right? But a whole lot of the other dynamics they're modeling, and it's a number of things here. The greater efficiency of housing is going to definitely help with household prices for people, rather than stock being locked in for a long period of time. Therefore, limited supply-demand dynamic with prices actually plays out. The actual greater efficiency, there's only a certain number of houses, even though there's more houses that are being built, apartments that are being built, relatively small percentage across the whole 2.8 million, you can imagine across the state. You can see a greater efficiency of use of stock there is only going to help as well. The model in the period of time, whether it's 1 year, whether it's 2 years, but it's a small percentage, and I'll touch on why. One of the things that people are concerned about is people using their $30,000, and I use the example that I put up on that residential example of the 2 teachers in the region. They use their $30,000 to buy, rather than a $500,000 house, they buy a $530,000 house. And people are worrying that that money will just go in and push up the prices. There are a couple of flaws in that argument. The first one is banks are very carefully looking at this. And you can imagine at the moment they might lend, say, 400,000 against that 500, but they look at the serviceability of that loan. And if they're looking at an annual tax that'll go into your net income after expenses, and they look at how much you're going to be able to repay, that will probably actually impact repayments and therefore impact how much they're going to loan. So rather than loaning 400, they might loan you 380 or 370, as opposed to 400 if you're going to take a property tax. So you've got to have a look at how this is all going to play out. It's not just as black and white as that money will just be used to push up the prices. Also, our user group testing has shown, as we asked the question, what would you use that money for? Amazing how many people go, I would actually use it to pay off and give myself a buffer in my mortgage at the start. So if I miss a few months, I'm not going to have a problem with my bank. And I might put half of it on that, and I might put half of it onto actually spending furniture, and furniture that I might not have had, or appliances I might not have had. So people are thinking through what they would actually use and how they use that flexibility. It's not all just going to go straight into pushing housing prices up. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but that's some of the things that are coming through from our ongoing user group testing and feedback and survey data.
Certainly you could see, given the shift towards unimproved land value versus a stamp duty that's obviously on the total value, you know, that it would also encourage people to spend that money on renovations on a new property, because that's value in their pocket that they're not going to get taxed on.
That's exactly right. And you think about that economy has stayed pretty buoyant all the way through. I know at the moment trying to get repairs done on my house, that builder's trying to juggle 6, right? Where they might have only had 2 12 months ago. And that market is pretty buoyant at the moment around renovations and people spending money they might spend on holidays or anything else at the moment.
Yeah, I can't stand this bathroom. We've got to change it. Look, there's a really pertinent question I want to get to from Alicia Posniak. What is the expected impact of the tax on rents, i.e. upward or downward pressure on the long or short term? Will investors pass on the stamp duty savings to tenants, or are there any mechanisms or considerations to mediate any of these impacts?
I'll take that one, James. So the impact on rents is, we've actually been more concerned about it going the other way, about in terms of if a landlord is paying the property tax, that being passed through, which, as we said, there'll be protections against that. I mean, to be honest, in the immediate, if the reform goes ahead in the immediate term, we are not expecting to see any change in rents, partly because particularly in the particularly for residential, in the residential sector, most people would be on a rental agreement. You can't, you know, in New South Wales law, you can't change the rent until the contract has run its course. So we don't expect to see things immediately change there. At the moment, the other taxes and charges that landlords pay, whether it's rates and other things, are actually tax deductible. So to the extent that they already pass on the impact of tax deductibility to in terms of rent, then, you know, you would probably see the same thing happening. But in all honesty, to start with, we don't really anticipate seeing any impact on rent. What happens over the longer term is, you know, you would probably, as the house prices come down, making housing affordable for all, then you would really expect to see rents showing the same relative trajectory, but that's sort of over the longer term. So, and, you know, no impact to start with, and that would be certainly something in terms of the protections we would be making sure that we keep a close eye on, that that there isn't anything untoward going on with rents, either in the commercial property space or in the residential space, and over the longer terms expect rents to move in line with broader property prices.
I think that's spot on. The only thing I'd add to that, Eamon, is that you have a look at the number of properties we're talking about transacting. 6% in the first year might become property tax, which means probably around 1% of properties will actually have the property tax, which could be passed on to people renting. If your property you're in, if it doesn't actually get sold and moved across to a property tax, there's no change, right? Remember, it's very, very minimal percentages of people that are actually going to be impacted from a rent perspective in the first 1 year, first 3 to 5 years, right? It's going to be a really minor departure from it. But Joanne's spot on, both on the commercial side, and we're working a lot with the commercial side on the DCA, UDIA. The way we're looking at that is if people paying an outgoing at the moment through a stamp duty, then they're not going to be able to pass on an additional amount through a property tax and until there's a rent review or there's an end of lease type discussion, and it protects both sides. And that's been reasonably well received in terms of a fairness type test.
So I've got a question from Joe Langley. Joe, I hope you're all right. I'm going to bundle your question in with one of my own. You mentioned that there's going to be an update from the Treasurer at the budget in June this year. Is there an expectation? Do you have an idea of when you would expect to see legislation introduced and the reform becoming effective? To that, I want to tack on, you've also talked about retrospectivity. Is the thinking around retrospectivity that this would be retrospective to the day of the announcement being made of the legislation being introduced, or are you potentially looking at retrospectivity, traveling back a number of years?
I can take that one. So retrospectivity, we're still, part of an announcement being in budget is we haven't even this consultation period, so there's still a lot of digesting the consultation feedback that we get back and coming forward with on the basis of that, what is the policy proposal that we put to government in terms of what reform that on the basis of the further work we've done in the consultation, what we think they should take forward, and what their decision around that is. Retrospectivity is part of that, and the timing around retrospectivity is part of the conversation we're having both through the consultation and actively considering as part of the further policy work that we're doing. It's not going to be years though. Whether it'll be on the basis of one announcement or another, I would say, but which one we're still working through, or indeed retrospectivity is to be part of the policy suite, but it certainly won't be years. In terms of when legislation might go through and it might start, obviously, given that one of the things that the benefits that this would bring is it helps stimulate the economy in the context of a recession. Good stimulus is going into the economy when the economy is at its worst point. So ideally, we're going ahead with this sooner rather than later, should the government choose to do so. But what that means in terms of timing of actual legislation going into Parliament, again, there's a lot of water under the bridge to go through terms of policy decisions by government and that sort of thing. But yeah. We would certainly expect the Treasurer to be making some sort of statement about what the government's intentions are in some substance at the time of the New South Wales budget.
That makes sense. Well, look, as someone who purchased a house a year and a half ago, I have to say I'm deeply, deeply disappointed. But from a public policy aficionado, I am so excited. This is such a wonderful reform. This is genuinely probably. The Henry Tax Review of 2008, listed this as maybe, I think, their most hated tax. And so to be tackling it in a way that's leading the country, that is, has threaded the needle of what could be a politically explosive reform in a clever way that allows for public support for this, is such a wonderful thing to have happened. And, I can only commend the pair of you and the enormous team I know that is sitting behind you to work on this stuff. Well done. I know we've got a long way to go. As you say, there's more water under the bridge to go, but it just feels wonderful that we're having this conversation at this point in time, and particularly in the context of reform to underpin, recovery from COVID-19. So look, with that, it's a good opportunity for us to finish a couple of minutes early. Thank you, James. Thank you, Joann. I really do appreciate your time. At the committee, we love having these sorts of conversations. It's great to have you both here. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity. And if people have got questions, put them in through those websites, please. We really look forward to receiving them. Thanks very much.
And for attendees, thank you for coming along. We'll see you at the next one. And otherwise, have a great rest of your Wednesday. See you later.